Welcome to Winter's SEO and this story time video. I've done a couple of story time videos now, but as I'm approaching my 4th birthday, or the channel is approaching its 4th birthday, I thought I'd finally make time to do the one about Brother Captain Sol Garro, because a number of people have been asking for it, so this is it. If you're new to story time videos, then I hope you enjoy it very much. If you want to hear this one in order, then this one follows directly after the story time I did called The Fate of the 13th and the Penitent Forge. In The Fate of the 13th and the Penitent Forge, I think the second half of it concerns itself with a story about a mass transport conveyor, the face of the sea. And this one directly follows after that one. So if you want to listen to them in order, go and listen to The Fate of the 13th and the Penitent Forge. I think it was about 6 months ago. And then listen to this one. Should be good painting material, at least I like to think it's good painting material. So without much further ado, let's dive in. Who is he? We don't know. Well, does he have a name? He won't give it up. The crew on the last spear called him Sol Garro. Sol Garro. Why? He said he came from the Sol system, sent by Garro. Brother Captain Mathias paused and looked through the armor-glass window to the airlock beyond, a vast space, big enough for a Questorus night. Empty now, save for a lone figure and Astartes in plain grey power armor, unpainted, unadorned. They had allowed him to keep his weapon, an old power sword, hung at his hip. The Space Marine stood in the center of the chamber, unmoving, staring straight back at Mathias through the armor glass. His gaze was unnerving. How many other survivors? Over 1,000, all civilian. He saved them all. Mathias should talk with him, said Mathias, turning away. Really? For one Astartes? The warp brought this man to us, and I would find out why, said Mathias. Honored Brother Mathias dreamed. He dreamed of a moment that was 4,000 years old, or was it a memory of a dream? Difficult to tell, difficult to know. So much time and so many dreams had passed, and his mind was not the same. It worked differently, now he was dead. And he had been dead for a long time, for 4,000 years. He dreamed that he was stood in the grand gallery of Lord Inquisitor Hume, with his battle brothers and a man he respected beyond all others, Chapter Master Manus. The gallery could have been a ballroom on an Imperial Guild world. So grand was its design, its pictures and frescoes and statues, but for the thrum of the ship's engines and the massive steel screen window at the far end of the hall that looked out into the stars and the black beyond. The window dominated the space like a void, a hole into midnight, and Hume was stood on a raised platform before it, shouting, pointing, and making accusations. Hume and his retinue outnumbered the Space Marines 10 to 1. Most of them were armed and armoured, and wore colours as brash and as loud as the Lord Inquisitor. They looked at the ragged band of Space Marines with scorn. Space Marines dressed in mixed and patched battle plate, from various colours, from various chapters now extinct. The Space Marines looked like they had been through hell, and many of them had, quite literally. I told you to bow, said Hume, pointing at the chapter master. I told you to kneel. I order you to kneel. I am Chapter Master Manus. I do not bend. And why not? The reign of blood is over. A new political order rises. A new imperium is born. You will submit. I represent the authority of the God Emperor of man. The Emperor is our creator, not a god. We are his weapons, and weapons do not fear or care about political order. We are his weapons, and we wage his war, not the Imperium's, and not yours. Then Mathias saw what he had seen 1,000 times before, what he had been unable to stop then, and what he was unable to stop now. The assassin materialized behind Manus, a plasma gun in its hand, pointing at the back of the chapter master's bare head. Suddenly, instantly, the assassin pulled the trigger, and the last surviving chapter master of the 13th founding died. Light flashed, vision, sound, heat, sensation. His dead mind was being brought back to life. He was being woken. War. He would get to kill again. He would bring ruin to the enemies of the Emperor one more time. The dream state vanished as the real world came flooding back, and he could feel the weight of time and the weight of memories too many to count. He could see the arming chamber, deck plates, wall panels, cogitators flashing, lumen bulbs flickering with heat, and baskets of incense hanging from old brass chains. Coolant vapours misted across the floor. A tech marine stood below him, tapping on a data slate. A red target lock flickered over the figure and then turned blue. Information flooded his cortex as the machine spirit whispered to him. Data scrolled down the right side of his vision. Reactor power, full. Motive systems, active. Vox, audio and other active and passive systems charged and alert. No mission data, troubling. Ammo count, 0. Weapon systems, 2 dreadnought power fists. He had arms, 2 industrial-sized machine arms. All this data took Mathias less than a second to process, and immediately he knew he was not being roused for war. If he could have sighed, he would have. Instead, he bent slightly and growled through a dreadnought speaker. "Who is it this time?" "Sire," said the tech marine, bowing and stepping back. "Captain Trazius seeks your counsel." Honoured brother Mathias detested ceremonies. At least he had not been working for a ceremony. But it was not war, and he was not pleased to hear what Trazius had to say, and he let the captain know it. Trazius apologized more than he should have, more than was fitting for an Astartes of the 13th, and Mathias let him know that too. He was stood with Trazius outside the massive airlock, and in the next chamber, the unknown warrior waited, still standing, still looking straight at the armor-glass window. Mathias turned his massive frame to look back. "Why keep him in the airlock?" "So we can vent if we need to." "Where are we?" "Nowhere." Mathias did not nod, could not nod. His dreadnought frame was not built to respond with subtlety. It was built for ruin and murder. But he understood the reference. To the 13th, nowhere meant deep space, the empty void between star systems. If they vented the chamber with Mathias and the unknown Astartes inside, Mathias would drift for a time until they recovered him. He rather liked the thought of it, floating alone in the black. "So you want me to talk with him?" said Mathias. It was not a question. "He could be a candidate. He saved lives, fought a demonic infestation." "He could be an enemy." "Which is why we seek your counsel, and the librarius will be listening." A short time later, the airlock blast doors grumbled open and Mathias thumped his way inside. The lone space marine in the center of the chamber turned, looked, and waited. Mathias did not know what he expected from the man, but this was not it. Even Astartes tended to take a step back, or at least bow prolifically, when he made an entrance. A 10-ton walking killing machine tended to tug on an instinctive part of the brain, a primal part of the brain. But this man just stood and watched him come. It was not until Mathias stopped a few paces away and the blast doors behind him slid shut did the space marine bow his head slightly and said, "Honoured brother, and they shall know no fear." "Is that why they sent you? Fear?" "No. The intention is dialogue. My counsel is respected." The lone space marine nodded, showing that he understood the game, the feeling out process, the start of things. "My name is Mathias," said the dreadnought. "Unusual," said the space marine. "No honor rolls, formal titles." "We are averse to titles." "And no insignia, no chapter markings, oath markings, or velt, as our wolf brothers would say. No story." "And you?" said Mathias, raising one power fist and pointing at the plain, grey ceramite of the space marine's power armor. Still, you have not given your name. Call me Sol Garro. I spent a month in the company of the crew from the last spear when it returned to your fleet. It seemed to work for them. You can see how this might be a problem, said Mathias. Sol Garro nodded. You do not let your titles define you. Why? Precisely because titles define, and the lens of the Imperium is cracked. Its vision is slurred with age and dogma. Definitions slide out of focus into some other place that's unrecognizable to those that follow the imperial truth. You fear you will be misrepresented? We are misrepresented. We are the 13th, the last surviving sons of the 13th founding, and we do not fit the narrative. Neither do I, said the Space Marine. He paused then, lost in a part of his mind that Mathias could not follow. Why is your name significant? Asked Mathias. Because I know him, and he doesn't know I am here, and if my name became known and spreads as these things do, he might see me coming. Sol Garro looked up, straight at the dreadnought's visual systems, and I don't want him to see me coming. I'm going to kill him. Who? Asked Mathias. Abaddon, said the Space Marine. Over the next few hours, the room outside the massive airlock became crowded with Astartes as more and more members of the 13th Fleet came to hear Sol Garro's story. Trazius was the first to send a call over the Vox, so that other officers could hear directly, and he would not have to repeat himself later. They, of course, called others. Within half an hour, a dozen Space Marines stood silently listening and staring through the armor-glass window at the stranger in the dreadnought. Half an hour later, there were 24 brothers. No one spoke. Everyone listened. Sol Garro said he was a legionary from before the Horus Heresy, 10,000 years earlier. When the heresy started, he became a knight-errant, chosen by Malcador the Sigillite, one of an elite handful of brothers who did the Sigillites, and by extension the Emperor's, bidding. At the time of the heresy, starship travel from one side of the galaxy to the other was made impossible by the ruin storm, a disturbance in the warp. The Sigillite was keen to see if the Ultramarines could be reached on the other side of the ruin storm, and sent Sol Garro and 2 of his brothers to make the attempt. And so they had left the Sol system and translated into the warp, and then somehow, in that impossible dimension where time and space have no real meaning, the impossible happened. Their frigate met another ship, crashed into it, merged with it, so they dropped out of the warp and back into real space, dragging the other ship with it, and when they did so, they were 10,000 years in the future. The ship they had merged with was the mass transport conveyor, the Face of the Sea. It was infested with demons and a few thousand human survivors. Sol Garro and his men eventually purged the conveyor of the demons and made it safe. This fight took months and claimed the lives of his 2 brother Astartes. Once the fighting was over, there was no way back into the warp and no way to complete his mission. Not only had 10,000 years passed, but both ships were no longer warp viable. He was adrift in space, a man out of time, with 1,000 civilians under his care. And they drifted for 13 years until the last spear of the 13th Fleet found them. During those 13 years adrift in space, Sol Garro had spoken with the survivors on board the Face of the Sea and plundered the ship's data stacks for information. He discovered where he was and when he was. Some truths were harder to swallow than others, such as the ecclesiarchy and the rise of the imperial cult. Some almost crippled him. The Emperor's fate on the Golden Throne was one such thing. Sol Garro talked about that for a while. I saw him once, he said, matter-of-factly. Mathias, who had been pacing the deck plates for some time, stopped suddenly. You saw the Emperor? At Ullanor, the great procession, and many of the Primarchs. The triumph of Ullanor, said Mathias, his vox speaker low, humbled. A thing of legend, The histories speak of thousands of Astartes and millions of guardsmen. There was more than that, many more, said Sol Garro. The Mechanicum had levelled an entire continent, and still it was not enough. Hundreds of thousands of legionaries. The Imperial army numbered more than 1 billion. Columns of armoured vehicles stretched over the horizon. More Titans than I thought existed. The sounds they made. And the air was so thick with ships you could barely see the sky. It was breathtaking, even for an Astartes. There was a pavilion at the end of the parade, over 100 meters high, and on it, the Emperor and 9 of the Primarchs. We marched past, our heads high. As I walked past, the Emperor turned his face down and looked straight at me. Now, you may not believe me. He was so high up and there were so many men. But I tell you, when the master of mankind looks you straight in the eye, you know. All my brothers knew it too. The next day my captain came to see me, to congratulate me. He had seen it. They had all seen it. I asked him what he thought it meant. He just said that I was destined for great things. Mathias said nothing for a moment. He had been alive in one form or another for 4,000 years, and it took something truly remarkable to make him pause. This made him pause. Perhaps your captain was a wise man, said Mathias finally. What was his name? Sol Garro took a couple of steps back and said, Abaddon. Now it was clear that the Space Marine was preparing to run, perhaps understandably afraid that an angry dreadnought was about to charge him down, but Mathias stood motionless. He was motionless because Mathias immediately walked through to Sebolt of the Librarius. Sebolt told him that Sol Garro was free of warp taint and that he spoke the truth, or that truth bled from his every word, as Sebolt put it. So while the stranger had intoned Abaddon's name for a second time, there was the other matter to consider. This man was sent from Malcador, the Sigillite. He had drifted in space for 13 years on board the mass conveyor until the 13th Fleet had found him. He'd been sent to reach the Ultramarines, the 13th Legion. The signs were there for anyone to see, so bright as to be obvious for someone as long-lived as Mathias. In the next room, things were not going so well for Captain Trazius. An argument broke out among the Astartes, and some of the loudest proponents said that they should vent the airlock. It took Trazius longer than he would have liked to quell the dissenters. As far as he was concerned, honoured brother Mathias's wisdom was to be trusted. There was a reason Trazius had woken the ancient, and Sol Garro's revelations only confirmed them. Mathias spoke again, and the gathering behind the armour glass fell silent and listened. You are a son of Horus. Some of us preferred the old names. We were wolves once. Nevertheless, your kind now worship the ruinous powers. There are none of my kind. I am the last. And despite these things, you would have me believe that Malcador trusted you? I'm not sure Malcador trusted anyone other than the Emperor. He was an impossible person to read. You met the Sigillite in person? Asked Mathias. On occasion. Mathias paused. Another internal vox hailed to the librarian. Sebolt continued to affirm that everything Sol Garro said was true, powerfully true, the old librarian mumbled. Fratricide, that's how it started, said Sol Garro. I read everything I could find on board the Face of the Sea, but much of your history of the heresy is propaganda or lies. Nowhere could I find mention of Istvan III. Istvan V, the drop site massacre, there was tiny scraps hidden here and there, lost amongst the noise and the fairy tales. But Istvan III, my guess is the information has been redacted or destroyed. There were loyalists amongst the traitor legions once. I suppose if that became widely known, Some might ask if there were traitors amongst the loyal legions, and there were. At the very start, everything was grey. The dividing lines were less clear. Mathias fell silent. The pneumatics of his dreadnought suit purred to a stop, and he listened. He listened to a story that very few in the 41st millennium had ever heard. He listened to a story of betrayal. Sol Garro spoke briefly about the crusade, and then spoke of Ullanor, where Horus became the war master and the emperor had returned to Terra. That was the point when things had started to change, he said. Slowly, so slowly at first. Then he spoke for some length about the years in the run-up to the betrayal, how his legion changed from the lunar wolves to the sons of Horus, and how the character of the legion changed with it. A planet called Murder, an extinct species called the Interrex, a moon in the Davin system. Perhaps these were details he did not need to add, but add them he did, painting a story of decline from something grand and worthy to something cracked, something out of focus. Then, Istvan III. Horus's first act of betrayal was against his own legion. It was a purging of the ranks, homicide against those who would not turn traitor, who would not turn against the Emperor's light. Perhaps a third of his legion, as well as a third of the Death Guard, World Eaters, and Emperor's children, were slaughtered at Istvan III, slaughtered by their own legions, by their own brothers. I was under the Coral City in the transit lines when they dropped the virus bombs and burned the world. My squad was returning to the surface when the gas came, covering everything, eating through everything. Metal turned to rust, rubber seals corroded and dripped away like wax. Glass turned to powder. My squad fell where they stood. I was on the edge of this walkway. I ran and jumped down onto a metal grate that was blistering and breaking under the gas. I went straight through that and down into the sewers under the city. There was a current there, rivers and rivers of filth and waste. I was carried some distance before the gas was ignited. Then the air caught fire, the water boiled away, and the tunnels caved in. I don't know how long I was down there. I know that by the time I had dug myself out, the war had moved on and the world was dead. About a year later, someone came looking. They took me off-world, back to Terra. I met the Sigillite. I did his bidding, and now, here I am. Sol Garro unbuckled the sword that hung at his waist and turned it over in his hands. The scabbard was plain and unremarkable. He drew the sword. The metal was blue and milky. Strange energy signals registered in the dreadnought's visual sensors. He gave me this, the Sigillite, said Sol Garro, just before I left for my mission through the ruin storm, and he said the strangest thing. Sol Garro stood to attention and lit the blade. Blue-white, its energy shield perfect and smooth, flawless. He said, "Take this blade. Find the 13th. You fight for them now." The lunar wolf stared up at the dreadnought. Mathias paused, considering all that he had heard, and then spoke loudly, so that those behind the armor glass would hear clearly. "Well then, brother, welcome to the fleet." The end. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed that story time. Now you know Sol Garro's secret. Please don't tell the Inquisition. As previously mentioned, there are other story times that you can look back through in the back catalogue and find them if you're interested in this sort of thing. Anyway, thanks for listening. Happy wargaming.